There's a skeleton lying in a research lab in Germany that shouldn't exist. Not in the way conspiracy theorists mean it, but in a way that's somehow even stranger. The bones are roughly 14,000 years old, pulled from a cave in Western Europe decades ago. Standard archaeological find. Except when scientists finally sequenced the DNA in 2016, they found something impossible. Genetic markers that don't match any known human population. Signatures from people who simply vanished from history, leaving almost nothing behind except whispers in our genes. If you're listening to this to fall asleep, that's exactly why I make these. So maybe subscribe and tell me where you're watching from and what time it is. I check the comments and it's like Tokyo at dawn, Toronto at midnight, all happening at once. Here's what keeps archaeologists awake at night. We know humans survived the last ice age. We know that when the glaciers finally retreated around 15,000 years ago, people moved back into Europe, following the migrating herds across frozen tundra that was slowly transforming into forest. We found their tools, their cave paintings, their campsites. We thought we understood their story. Then we looked at their DNA, and nothing made sense anymore. The bones in that German lab belonged to someone scientists now call a Western hunter-gatherer. These were supposedly the first people to recolonize Europe after the ice sheets melted. The ancestors of everyone who lived on the continent before farmers arrived from the Middle East. That's what the textbooks said. That's what we taught for decades. But the DNA told a different story, a much stranger one. See, when geneticists compared these ancient European genomes to each other, they found something shocking. Huge chunks of DNA that appeared out of nowhere. Genetic sequences that couldn't be traced to any known migration, any documented population, any fossil we'd ever found. It was like discovering that a stranger had been living in your house for years, and you never even knew they were there. Scientists call them ghost populations. People who left almost no archaeological trace, no pottery with their fingerprints, no settlements we can definitively identify, no written records, obviously, just faint genetic echoes buried in the DNA of people who came thousands of years later, phantoms from the ice. The deeper researchers dug into ancient European DNA, the worse the mystery became. They weren't finding one ghost population. They were finding several, multiple waves of people moving through Europe after the Ice Age, mixing, separating, sometimes disappearing entirely. The neat story we'd constructed about Europe's first peoples, the simple narrative of hunters following game across empty landscapes, shattered into 1,000 complicated pieces. And here's what makes this genuinely unsettling. These weren't primitive wanderers who got absorbed into more advanced cultures. Some of these lost peoples survived for thousands of years. They had sophisticated tools, created art, built communities. They were successful, thriving even. Then they vanished so completely that we didn't know they existed until we could read the molecular traces they left behind. Think about that. Entire populations of humans, living, loving, raising children, creating culture, surviving in one of the harshest environments on Earth, gone so thoroughly that 14,000 years later, we can only detect them as statistical anomalies in genetic databases. Not conquered, not obviously wiped out by disease or disaster, just absent from the record like someone carefully erased them from history. This is the story of Europe's lost children. The people who came after the ice but before history. The ones who left DNA but almost nothing else. The ghosts who haunt every ancient European genome we sequence, raising more questions than they answer. Who were they? Where did they come from? What happened to them? And most disturbing of all, how many other lost peoples are hiding in our genes, waiting to be discovered? The ice kept their secrets for 14,000 years. Now finally we're learning to listen to the whispers. 20,000 years ago, Europe didn't exist. Not the Europe we know anyway. Not the continent of forests and rivers and rolling hills. What existed was something alien. something almost incomprehensible. A frozen wasteland that stretched from Britain to the Urals, buried under ice sheets 2 miles thick. This was the last glacial maximum, the deepest freeze of the Ice Age, the moment when Earth's climate reached its coldest extreme and stayed there for thousands of years. If you could somehow travel back to this time, you wouldn't recognize anything. The coastlines were completely different. Britain wasn't an island. It was connected to mainland Europe by hundreds of miles of exposed continental shelf. The North Sea was a vast plain of frozen tundra. The Baltic didn't exist at all, just more ice. Scandinavia was completely buried under glaciers that stretched south, past what would become Denmark and northern Germany. And it wasn't just the ice sheets themselves that made Europe uninhabitable. It was everything the ice did to the climate around it. Cold air poured off those massive glaciers like water off a cliff, creating permanent high-pressure systems that blocked warm, moist air from reaching the continent. Rain became rare. Snow fell, but it never melted, just accumulated year after year, century after century compressing into more ice. South of the main ice sheets you had permafrost, ground frozen solid year-round, sometimes hundreds of feet deep. Nothing could grow except the hardiest tundra plants. Lichens, mosses, dwarf willows that barely rose above ankle height. During the brief summer months, the surface would thaw just enough to create boggy marshland, breeding grounds for clouds of insects but offering little shelter or food for humans. This was Europe for thousands of years, a frozen desert, inhospitable, deadly, empty of human life across vast stretches, but not everywhere. Here's where the story gets interesting. Because even at the height of the last glacial maximum, humans were in Europe. Not many, not spread evenly, but they were there, holding on in tiny pockets of survivable territory that archaeologists call refugia. Refugia are exactly what they sound like. Places of refuge. Small regions where local geography created microclimates warm enough, stable enough to support human life even when everything around them was frozen wasteland. These were usually in southern Europe, the Iberian Peninsula, modern-day Spain and Portugal, where Mediterranean influences kept conditions slightly more moderate. Parts of Italy, particularly in sheltered valleys on the southern coast. The Balkans, where complex mountain geography created protected zones, and possibly parts of the Ukrainian plains, though evidence there is scarce and controversial. The archaeological record from these refugia is fascinating and frustrating in equal measure. Fascinating because it proves humans were there, surviving against incredible odds. Frustrating because it raises more questions than it answers. Cave sites in northern Spain show continuous human occupation through the coldest periods. Not dense populations, but persistent ones. People living in the same valleys for hundreds of generations, perfecting survival strategies for an environment that never gave them margin for error. Tool assemblages from these sites show remarkable sophistication. Carefully crafted stone points for hunting, bone needles for sewing cold weather clothing, engraving tools for creating the extraordinary cave art that would later make places like Altamira and Lascaux famous. But here's the mystery. These populations were small, tiny, really. Genetic estimates suggest that during the last glacial maximum, the entire human population of Europe might have been just a few thousand individuals scattered across these isolated refugia, separated by hundreds of miles of impassable tundra and ice. How did they survive? Not just physically, but socially. Populations that small face serious genetic problems, inbreeding, reduced genetic diversity, vulnerability to disease outbreaks. Yet somehow these groups persisted, maintained complex cultural traditions, continued developing new technologies, stayed human in every meaningful sense of the word, despite living in conditions that would make Antarctic research stations look comfortable. The landscape they inhabited was harsh, but not entirely barren. This is important to understand. Yes, Europe was frozen. Yes, it was desperately cold and dry. But it wasn't lifeless. The tundra supported megafauna that would make modern African savannas look understocked. Woolly mammoths moving in great herds across the frozen plains. Woolly rhinoceroses, bizarre-looking creatures covered in thick fur. Giant elk with antlers spanning 12 feet. Cave bears larger than modern grizzlies. Cave lions, massive predators that hunted in packs. And these animals weren't just surviving, they were thriving. The cold-adapted megafauna of Ice Age Europe had evolved perfect strategies for extracting calories from tundra plants. They could survive on lichens and tough grasses that would starve modern cattle. They had thick layers of fat and fur that turned them into walking insulation systems. For human hunters clever enough to take them down, these animals represented enormous resources. A single mammoth could feed a band of 30 people for weeks, maybe months if the meat could be frozen and preserved. The fat could be burned for heat and light. The bones could be used for tools and even construction. Archaeological sites from Siberia show structures built entirely from mammoth bones, houses that kept people alive through winters that lasted most of the year. But hunting megafauna wasn't easy. These were dangerous, powerful animals. A cornered woolly rhinoceros could kill you instantly. Mammoth hunting required coordination, strategy, weapons capable of penetrating thick hide and fat layers. The humans who survived the last glacial maximum weren't just tough, they were smart, organized, capable of planning complex operations and executing them flawlessly, because mistakes meant death. And then, around 19,000 years ago, something changed. The first signs were subtle, slight temperature increases, barely noticeable year to year but accumulating over centuries. The great ice sheets began to retreat, not quickly, not uniformly, but inexorably. Summer melt started exceeding winter accumulation. Glaciers that had been advancing for thousands of years began pulling back. The thaw was beginning, and it would transform everything. As temperatures rose, the refugees' populations faced a choice. They could stay in their traditional territories, the valleys and coastal areas that had sheltered them through the worst of the freeze, or they could expand northward, following the retreating ice, colonizing territories that were becoming habitable for the first time in thousands of years. They chose expansion. Within a few thousand years, humans were spreading across Europe again, moving into lands their ancestors had abandoned tens of thousands of years earlier. But these weren't just any humans. These were people who carried with them all the survival knowledge accumulated during the glacial maximum. People whose genes had been selected for cold tolerance, for intelligence, for the ability to cooperate under the most desperate circumstances. And here's the question that would haunt archaeologists and geneticists for the next century. Where exactly did they come from? Which refugia contributed most to the repopulation? And most mysteriously, were all of Europe's post-Ice Age inhabitants descended from known refugia populations? Or were there ghost populations, groups that survived in places we haven't discovered, whose genes and cultures would shape the continent in ways we're only beginning to understand? The answers, as we'll see, are stranger than anyone expected. Around 19,000 years ago, something remarkable happened in Europe. The continent had been locked in ice for millennia. Glaciers stretched from Scandinavia down to what's now northern France. Temperatures that would make a modern winter feel tropical. Endless frozen tundra where forests had once stood. This was the last glacial maximum, the peak of the Ice Age, when sheets of ice miles thick covered nearly everything, and yet people were there, living, thriving even, in conditions that would kill most modern humans within days. These weren't just survivors clinging desperately to life. These were artists, innovators, master craftspeople, who created some of the most stunning artwork humanity has ever produced. We call them the Magdalenians, named after a rock shelter in France where their artifacts were first identified. But that name doesn't capture what they really were. They were possibly Europe's first true civilization, a culture so sophisticated it wouldn't be matched for thousands of years. The first hints of Magdalenian life appeared in the archaeological record in the mid-1800s. Excavators digging in caves across France and Spain kept finding the same thing. Beautiful stone tools carefully crafted from flint with an attention to detail that seemed almost obsessive. Harpoons carved from reindeer antler, so perfectly balanced they could still be used for fishing today. Needles made from bone, fine enough to sew fitted clothing complete with eyes for thread that would make modern seamstresses jealous. But it was the art that changed everything. In 1940, 4 teenagers exploring near Montignac in southwestern France stumbled into a cave system that had been sealed for 17,000 years. What they found inside stopped the world. Chamber after chamber covered in paintings, bulls, horses, deer, aurochs, rendered in such vivid detail you could see individual muscles, the texture of their coats, the wildness in their eyes. The artists had used the natural contours of the cave walls to give their subjects dimension, creating 3-dimensional effects that wouldn't be rediscovered until the Renaissance. This was Lascaux, and it was just the beginning. Over the following decades, archaeologists found cave after cave filled with Magdalenian art. Altamira in Spain, with its famous basin painted in ochre and charcoal. Nio in the French Pyrenees, where paintings lie nearly a kilometre deep inside the mountain. Font de Gaume, with over 200 figures covering its walls. Each site revealed the same stunning truth. These Ice Age people weren't primitive. They were sophisticated beyond anything anyone had imagined. They didn't just paint. They sculpted. Small figurines carved from mammoth ivory with details so fine they needed magnifying glasses to appreciate them fully. They created musical instruments, flutes carved from bird bones and mammoth ivory that could play complex melodies. One flute found in southern Germany is over 40,000 years old and still playable. The notes it produces would sound familiar to any modern musician. They developed specialized tools for specific tasks. Burin chisels for engraving, backed bladelets for composite tools, spear throwers that could launch projectiles twice as far as hand-thrown spears. Each innovation carefully crafted and refined over generations. This wasn't random scavenging and lucky survival. This was systematic technological development. But who were these people? Where did they come from? For over a century, that question had no good answer. The Magdalenians appeared in the archaeological record around 17,000 years ago, seemingly from nowhere. They flourished for about 5,000 years across Western Europe, from Spain to Poland, from southern France to the British Isles. Then, as the Ice Age ended and the climate warmed, they vanished. Or rather, their distinctive culture vanished. The cave paintings stopped. The elaborate bone carvings disappeared. The sophisticated stone tools gave way to simpler designs. What happened to them? Did they die out? Were they replaced by newcomers? Did they simply change their way of life as the environment transformed around them? For generations, archaeologists could only speculate based on artifacts and artwork. But then DNA analysis arrived, and everything changed. In 2016, researchers managed to extract and sequence DNA from Magdalenian remains. Bones from cave sites across Europe, some over 15,000 years old, carefully preserved in the cold, dry conditions that had protected them through the millennia. The genetic material was fragmentary, degraded by time, but there was enough to read the story written in their genes. What they found was shocking. The Magdalenians had a unique genetic signature. They weren't closely related to any modern European population. They carried genetic markers that suggested their ancestors had been in Europe for a very long time, possibly since before the last glacial maximum. They had weathered the worst of the Ice Age in refuges, small pockets of survivable territory in southern France, northern Spain, maybe parts of Italy. While glaciers covered most of the continent, these small populations had held on in Ice Age refuges where the climate was slightly less brutal. For thousands of years they lived in these refuges, small groups, maybe a few hundred people total, spread across Western Europe, connected by kinship networks and trade routes. They developed their sophisticated culture in isolation, cut off from other human populations by walls of ice and endless frozen tundra. This explains why their artwork is so distinctive, so different from anything found in Africa or Asia, or even other parts of Europe from the same time period. They were creating in isolation, developing their own aesthetic traditions, their own symbolic systems. The cave paintings weren't just art for art's sake. They were communication systems, ways of recording information about animal behavior, seasonal migrations, hunting strategies. Some researchers think the caves served as teaching sites, where knowledge was passed from one generation to the next. The paintings would have been created by firelight, flickering flames making the animals seem to move, bringing the lessons to life. The same caves show evidence of repeated use over thousands of years, people returning to the same sites generation after generation, adding new paintings, refreshing old ones, maintaining what was essentially a library of survival knowledge encoded in images. This makes sense when you think about the challenges they faced. In the frozen world of Ice Age Europe, knowledge was everything. Knowing when reindeer herds would migrate, which plants were edible, how to find water when everything was frozen solid, these weren't just useful skills. They were the difference between life and death. The Magdalenians had developed systems to preserve and transmit that knowledge across generations. Their elaborate culture wasn't luxury, it was survival strategy. But here's where the story takes its darkest turn. When researchers compared Magdalenian DNA to the genetic signatures of later European populations, they found something disturbing. The Magdalenian genetic lineage essentially vanishes around 14,000 years ago. Their distinctive genetic markers disappear from the European gene pool almost completely. Some populations show trace amounts, tiny fragments that suggest limited interbreeding, but the main Magdalenian lineage just stops appearing in the archaeological record. It's as if they were erased. What happened? The timing coincides with the end of the Ice Age. As glaciers retreated and temperatures warmed, the environment the Magdalenians had adapted to disappeared. The reindeer herds they depended on moved north following the cold weather. The tundra gave way to forests. Everything changed. Maybe they couldn't adapt fast enough. Maybe populations that had survived in refuges for thousands of years were too specialized for Ice Age conditions. When those conditions vanished, so did they. Or maybe something else happened. Maybe they were replaced. Around the same time the Magdalenian genetic signature fades, new populations begin appearing in Europe. People with different genetic markers, different tool traditions, different ways of life. Were the Magdalenians outcompeted, absorbed, actively displaced? The genetic data can't tell us. It can only show us that they were there, and then they weren't. Some of their genes survive through interbreeding. Tiny fragments of Magdalenian DNA show up in later populations, evidence that at least some mixing occurred before the main lineage disappeared. But their unique genetic signature, the markers that identified someone as distinctly Magdalenian, those vanish almost completely. This creates one of the most haunting mysteries in European prehistory. The people who created humanity's first great artistic tradition, who survived the worst of the Ice Age, who developed sophisticated technologies and complex cultural practices, they left almost no genetic legacy. Their caves remain, their paintings still vivid on stone walls, their tools lie in museum collections, testimony to their skill and intelligence. But their bloodline, the actual genetic continuity from them to modern Europeans, it's almost non-existent. Were they Europe's first peoples? In some sense, yes. They were among the earliest humans to permanently inhabit the continent during the Ice Age. But they weren't the ancestors of modern Europeans. They were something else entirely, a ghost population that flourished briefly in the harsh world of frozen Europe and then faded into the mist of prehistory. And the most frustrating part, we have so many questions and so few answers. How did they first arrive in their Ice Age refuges? What language did they speak? What stories did they tell around their fires? What did they believe about life and death and the animals they painted so beautifully? The caves can't answer these questions. The DNA reveals lineages and migrations, but it can't recover thoughts or words or beliefs. We can see what they made, but we can't know what they dreamed. Researchers keep searching. New excavations reveal new sites, new bones, new fragments of DNA to analyze. Each discovery adds another piece to the puzzle. But the central mystery remains. The Magdalenians were here, they were brilliant. They survived when survival seemed impossible. And then they were gone, leaving behind only shadows painted on stone walls and questions that may never be fully answered. They were Europe's first wave, but they wouldn't be the last. Around 14,000 years ago, something strange happened in Europe. A new genetic signature appears in the archaeological record. Not gradually, not as a slow evolution from existing populations, but suddenly. Like someone flipped a switch and an entirely new group of people materialized across the continent. Scientists call it the Villa Bruna cluster. Named after a skeleton found in northern Italy, it represents a genetic profile that shows up in human remains from Spain to Russia, from Scandinavia to the Mediterranean. And here's what makes it so unsettling. We have no idea where it came from. To understand how bizarre this is, you need to understand what scientists were expecting to find. Ancient DNA analysis isn't like reading a history book. It's more like detective work, except the crime scene is 14,000 years old, and the evidence has been degraded by millennia of bacterial contamination, chemical breakdown, and environmental damage. When researchers extract DNA from prehistoric bones, they're working with fragments, tiny pieces of genetic code scattered among massive amounts of contamination from soil bacteria, fungi, and modern humans who've handled the remains. Getting usable ancient DNA is like trying to reconstruct a specific book after it's been shredded, burned, buried in mud for 14,000 years and mixed with pieces of 10,000 other books. But when they do get clean samples, the results are remarkable. Every person's DNA tells a story about their ancestors, where they came from, who they mixed with, how they're related to other populations. It's a family tree written in genetic code stretching back thousands of generations. So when scientists started analyzing remains from post-Ice Age Europe, they expected to see a clear progression. The Magdalenians and other groups from the Ice Age should show genetic continuity with the populations that came after. Parents to children to grandchildren, an unbroken chain of ancestry stretching from the height of the Ice Age through the warming period and into the Holocene. That's not what they found. Instead, around 14,000 years ago, a new genetic signature appears. The Villa Bruna cluster shows ancestry that doesn't match the earlier Magdalenian populations. It's not that they are completely different. They're clearly related, clearly part of the same broader European lineage. But there are markers, specific genetic variants that suggest this population had ancestors who had been separated from the Magdalenians for thousands of years. Where had they been? The obvious answer would be that they came from somewhere else. migrants from another continent moving into Europe and replacing or mixing with existing populations. But here's the problem. The Villa-Brunner genetic signature doesn't clearly match populations from Africa, the Middle East or Asia either. It's distinctly European, carrying many of the same deep ancestry markers as the earlier Ice Age populations. It's as if a group of Europeans had vanished for 10,000 years and then suddenly reappeared, genetically distinct from their relatives but clearly from the same ultimate source. This is what scientists call a ghost population, a group of people who must have existed, whose genetic signature proves they were real, but who left almost no archaeological trace. They're invisible to traditional archaeology but written clearly in the DNA of later populations. Some researchers think they know where these ghosts were hiding. During the Ice Age, Europe wasn't uniformly frozen. While glaciers covered Scandinavia and northern Britain, and permafrost stretched across the plains, there were refuges, small pockets of relatively mild climate where plants could grow and animals could survive. These refuges weren't pleasant by modern standards. Winters were still brutal, summers were short, and resources were limited. But compared to the frozen wastelands around them, they were paradise. The genetic evidence suggests there might have been hidden populations living in these refuges throughout the Ice Age. Small groups, maybe just a few hundred individuals, isolated from the main Magdalenian populations by hundreds of miles of glaciers and frozen tundra. They survived, adapted, developed their own distinct genetic profile. Then, when the ice began to retreat, they expanded. Moving out of their refuges, they spread across Europe, encountering and mixing with the descendants of the Magdalenians. This would explain the sudden appearance of the Villa-Brunner signature. Not migrants from another continent, but Europeans who'd been there all along, just hidden in places archaeologists haven't found or haven't recognized. But this explanation raises its own questions. Where exactly were these refuges? Southern Spain and Italy are obvious candidates. They're warmer, closer to the Mediterranean, better protected from the worst of the Ice Age climate. Archaeological evidence shows continuous human occupation in these regions throughout the glacial maximum. But the genetics don't quite work out. The Villa-Brunner signature shows up in northern Europe too quickly, too uniformly, to have spread only from Mediterranean refuges. Some researchers propose refuges further north, the Balkans perhaps, or isolated valleys in the Alps where local geography created microclimates warm enough to support human populations. There's even speculation about ice-free zones along the Atlantic coast, areas where warm ocean currents prevented complete glaciation. The problem is proving any of this. Ice Age sea levels were 400 feet lower than today. If there were coastal refuges, they're now underwater, buried under centuries of marine sediment. Any archaeological sites they left behind are gone, destroyed by rising seas when the glaciers melted. And if the refugees were in mountain valleys or other isolated locations, finding them is like looking for needles in a haystack. Europe is big. The Ice Age was long. Small groups of humans living in isolated refuges wouldn't have left much archaeological evidence, even under the best preservation conditions. So we're left with genetic ghosts, populations we know existed but can't quite find. But DNA isn't the only evidence. Skeletal remains themselves tell stories that genetics alone can't capture. When anthropologists examine Ice Age skeletons, they look at more than just DNA extraction points. They measure bone thickness, analyze muscle attachment sites, study toothwear patterns, examine signs of disease and injury. All of this reveals how people lived, what they ate, how hard they worked, what challenges they faced. And here's where things get interesting. The skeletal remains associated with the Villa-Brunner genetic cluster show subtle but consistent differences from earlier Magdalenian remains. Not dramatic changes, not different species, but variations in build and bone structure that suggest different lifestyles. Villa-Brunner associated skeletons tend to be slightly more graceful, lighter bone structure, less robust muscle attachments. This could mean many things. Perhaps they lived in environments where hunting large game was less important. Perhaps they had developed technologies that made physical strength less crucial for survival. Perhaps they simply had different diets, different daily activities. Some skeletons show evidence of seafood consumption. Chemical analysis of bone collagen can reveal what someone ate during their lifetime, and several Villa cluster individuals show isotope ratios consistent with marine resources. This suggests coastal populations, people who'd learned to exploit fish, shellfish, and sea mammals. This fits with the hidden refuge theory. If populations survived the Ice Age along the Atlantic coast, they would have developed maritime survival skills out of necessity. The ocean doesn't freeze. Even during the worst of the glaciation, coastal waters would have supported fish and seal populations. For small groups of humans, the sea might have been more reliable than the frozen land. But then there's the replacement theory. Not everyone agrees these ghost populations were Europeans hiding in refuges. Some researchers argue the genetic evidence suggests something more dramatic. What if the Villa cluster represents a population that had left Europe entirely during the early Ice Age and then returned when conditions improved? Imagine this. When the glaciers first advanced, some human populations fled south, not just to Mediterranean refuges, but all the way into North Africa or the Middle East. They lived there for thousands of years, adapting to new environments, developing new technologies and cultural practices. Then, when the ice retreated, their descendants moved back north, recolonizing Europe and encountering the Magdalenians who'd managed to survive in European refuges. This would explain why the Villa genetic signature appears suddenly. It wasn't emerging from hidden European refuges, it was returning from outside Europe entirely. The mixing we see in the genetic record isn't refuge populations meeting Ice Age survivors, it's returnees meeting the descendants of people who never left. The archaeological record provides tantalizing hints that this might have happened. Around the same time the Villa signature appears, new tool technologies show up in Europe. New styles of stone points, new methods of working bone and antler, new artistic traditions. These innovations don't seem to evolve gradually from Magdalenian traditions. They appear somewhat suddenly, as if introduced from outside. But again, proving this conclusively is nearly impossible. Ancient DNA from North Africa and the Middle East during this period is scarce. Climate conditions in these regions are terrible for DNA preservation. Heat and humidity destroy genetic material far faster than cold European conditions. So we can't easily test whether populations in these areas show the right ancestry to be the source of the Villa cluster. Then there's the truly wild possibility. What if we're looking at evidence of something stranger than either hidden refugees or return migrations? What if the Villa signature represents mixing with a population we've never identified at all? Remember, this is the same period when modern humans were interbreeding with Neanderthals and Denisovans. We know there were at least 3 human species coexisting and occasionally mixing. What if there were others? Small populations, maybe just a few thousand individuals surviving in isolated pockets and occasionally interbreeding with modern humans. The genetic signature would be subtle. After tens of thousands of years and countless generations of mixing, any DNA from unknown human species would be diluted almost beyond recognition. But it might still leave traces, unusual genetic markers that don't fit neatly into any known population. Ghost DNA from ghost people. This isn't as crazy as it sounds. In 2019, researchers announced they'd found evidence of an unknown hominin species in the DNA of modern West Africans. Not Neanderthal, not Denisovan, but something else. Something that left no fossils, no tools, no clear archaeological evidence, but is still detectable in our genes. Could the Villa cluster include similar ghost ancestry? DNA from small populations of archaic humans who survived into the late Ice Age and mixed with modern humans as the glaciers retreated. Most researchers think this is unlikely. The Willebrunner genetic signature doesn't show the clear hallmarks of archaic admixture. It looks fundamentally like modern human DNA, just with an unusual ancestry profile. But unlikely isn't impossible. And in science, especially in paleoanthropology, today's fringe theory sometimes becomes tomorrow's established fact. What we know for certain is this. 14,000 years ago, Europe's genetic landscape changed dramatically. New ancestry appeared, spread rapidly, and mixed with existing populations to create the genetic foundation of later European hunter-gatherers. This new ancestry had to come from somewhere, from hidden Ice Age refuges, from populations that had left Europe and returned, from unknown groups we've yet to identify, or from some combination of all three. The ghost populations were real. Their DNA proves it. They lived, survived, reproduced, and passed their genes to us. Every person of European descent carries some trace of these mysterious people. We are their descendants, whether we'll ever know their full story or not. And that's perhaps the most haunting part. These weren't ancient ancestors from the deep past. These were people living just 14,000 years ago. That's nothing in evolutionary terms, just 560 generations. Your 560 times great-grandparents were alive when these ghost populations emerged from wherever they had been hiding. They walked across landscapes we'd recognize, hunted animals whose descendants still exist, looked up at the same constellations we see today. They were fully modern humans with brains identical to ours, capable of everything we're capable of, and we don't even know where they came from. Now we need to talk about the people who actually dominated Europe for most of the post-Ice Age period. Not some distant theoretical population, but real flesh and blood humans whose DNA we can extract, whose bones we can study, whose faces we can reconstruct with stunning accuracy. They're called the Western Hunter-Gatherers, or WHG in the scientific literature, and until very recently, we had no idea they existed. Here's what makes them so remarkable. For approximately 6,000 years, from around 14,000 years ago until about 8,000 years ago, these people were the masters of post-glacial Europe. They lived everywhere, from Britain to the Balkans, from Spain to Poland. They weren't some small isolated group clinging to survival. They were the dominant human population across an entire continent. And we forgot they existed, completely, until genetic analysis revealed them hiding in plain sight within European DNA. The first real glimpse we got of the Western hunter-gatherers came from a skeleton discovered in Luxembourg. Not some spectacular burial, not some ceremonial site, just a rock shelter called Lochbohr where someone had been laid to rest about 8,000 years ago. When researchers finally extracted DNA from the Lochbohr man's bones in 2013, they expected to find genetics similar to modern Europeans. After all, this was Europe, right? These were our ancestors, living on our continent just a few thousand years ago. Instead, they found something nobody predicted. The Lochbohr man was genetically distinct from modern Europeans. Not completely foreign, not unrelated, but different enough that it was clear a major population replacement had occurred sometime between his death and the present day. He represented a people who had once dominated Europe but had since been largely replaced or absorbed by later migrations. But the real shock came when they tried to reconstruct what he looked like. Using genetic markers for pigmentation, the researchers made a discovery that challenged every assumption about ancient Europe. The Lochbohr man had dark skin. Not the pale complexion we associate with northern Europeans today, but skin tones similar to modern sub-Saharan Africans, and he had bright blue eyes. Stop and think about that for a moment. Dark skin and blue eyes. It's a combination that's vanishingly rare in modern populations, almost never seen. But 8,000 years ago, this was normal for Western hunter-gatherers. This was what the people who dominated post-Ice Age Europe actually looked like. Then came Cheddar Man. In 2018, researchers extracted DNA from Britain's oldest complete skeleton, a man who'd been buried in Gough's Cave in Somerset about 10,000 years ago. The genetics confirmed he was Western hunter-gatherer, and when they reconstructed his appearance, they found the same striking combination: dark skin, blue eyes, and what the forensic artist described as an immediately recognizable African facial structure combined with European features. The British press went wild. Here was the oldest Briton, and he looked nothing like modern British people. He looked like someone from North Africa had been given blue eyes and dropped into the English countryside during the Mesolithic period. Schools had to update their teaching materials. Museums revised their exhibits. The public understanding of ancient Europe shifted overnight. But it wasn't just their appearance that made the Western hunter-gatherers remarkable. It was their success. These people had survived the end of the Ice Age, one of the most dramatic climate shifts in recent geological history, and thrived in its aftermath. As the glaciers retreated and the tundra gave way to forests, they adapted with breathtaking efficiency. The archaeological record shows they were sophisticated hunters, taking down everything from red deer to wild boar to aurochs, those massive wild cattle that once roamed Europe. They weren't just running down prey with spears. They were using complex strategies, understanding animal behavior patterns, knowing when and where different game would be available throughout the year. They fished extensively. Sites across Europe show enormous middens, trash heaps essentially, filled with fish bones, shellfish remains, and the debris of aquatic hunting. They understood seasonal fish migrations, knew how to preserve catches for lean times, developed specialized tools for different kinds of fishing. Some coastal populations were taking deep water fish, suggesting they had boats and sophisticated maritime knowledge. But they weren't just hunters and fishers. They were also expert foragers who understood plant resources with encyclopedic thoroughness. They knew which nuts were worth the effort to process, which berries were safe, which roots could sustain you through winter. More importantly, they knew how to manage the landscape. There's growing evidence that Western hunter-gatherers engaged in what we'd now call landscape management, using fire to maintain clearings that attracted game animals, encouraging the growth of useful plants, essentially doing a proto-form of agriculture without actually planting crops. Their territory was vast. Western hunter-gatherer remains and artifacts have been found from the Atlantic coast of Spain to the plains of Poland, from southern Italy to the British Isles. This wasn't a single tribe or even a single culture. It was a loose network of related populations, all sharing similar genetics but adapted to wildly different environments. The WHG living in coastal Spain faced completely different challenges than those in the forests of Germany or the coastlands of Britain. Yet the genetic evidence shows they remained connected, that there was enough movement and interbreeding between groups to maintain genetic continuity across the entire range. We can glimpse their spiritual lives through their burial practices, and what we see is fascinating. Western hunter-gatherers buried their dead carefully, deliberately. Not always in the same way. Different groups had different traditions, but always with clear intention. Some burials include what archaeologists call grave goods, tools or ornaments placed with the deceased. Others show evidence of red ochre, that iron oxide powder that humans have been using in burials for tens of thousands of years, the pigment that seems to have had ritual significance across countless cultures and millennia. At some sites, we find multiple burials, families perhaps, or community members placed together. The positioning varies. Some individuals are buried in fetal positions, others stretched out, some sitting upright. Each variation probably had meaning, represented beliefs about death, and what came after that we can only guess at now. But the care taken is clear. These weren't just corpses being disposed of. These were people whose deaths mattered, whose passing was marked with ceremony and intention. Some burial sites show evidence of feasting, animal bones deposited around graves, signs of fires, indications that communities gathered to mark the death of one of their own. This suggests social structures complex enough to bring people together for ceremonial purposes. It suggests beliefs about death important enough to invest significant time and resources in proper burial rites. We find ornamentation too. Beads made from shells, sometimes from shells that came from hundreds of miles away, suggesting trade networks or seasonal migrations. Perforated animal teeth that would have been worn as pendants or sewn onto clothing. Evidence of body decoration, of personal adornment, of people who cared about how they looked and how they were remembered. One particularly striking burial in Italy contained a young man with a headdress made from hundreds of shell beads and what appears to have been a ceremonial staff. The time investment required to create such items is staggering. Each bead had to be individually shaped and perforated using stone tools. The shells had to be sourced from coastal areas. Someone, probably multiple people, spent weeks or months creating the burial goods for this one individual. That suggests social hierarchies, suggests some people held positions of importance or spiritual significance within their communities. But here's what's really fascinating about the Western hunter-gatherers. They challenge every simplistic narrative about human progress and development. We tend to think of hunter-gatherers as primitive, as people living hand to mouth, barely surviving, waiting for agriculture to come along and save them. The WHG demolish that assumption. These people weren't struggling. They were thriving. For 6,000 years, they were the dominant human population across an entire continent. They had rich cultural lives, sophisticated technologies, extensive social networks, and spiritual beliefs complex enough to motivate elaborate burial rituals. They were healthy too. Skeletal analysis shows they were generally well nourished, with few signs of the nutritional deficiencies that would plague later agricultural populations. They were tall, often taller than the farmers who would eventually replace them. Their bones show they were physically active but not overtaxed, suggesting lives of varied activity rather than repetitive agricultural labor. And they were smart. The tool technologies developed during the Mesolithic period, the time when WHG dominated Europe, show continuous innovation. Stone tool designs become more sophisticated, more specialized. We see the development of microliths, tiny stone blades that could be hafted together to create composite tools. We see specialized fishing gear, improved weapons, better food processing implements. This isn't stagnation. This is a population continuously adapting and innovating. So why don't we look like them today? Why did their distinctive genetic signature largely disappear from modern European populations? That's where the story gets complicated, because around 8,000 years ago, something began to change. New people started arriving in Europe from the southeast, people with different genetics, different technologies, and a completely new way of life. They brought agriculture, they brought domesticated animals, and slowly, inexorably, they began to replace the Western hunter-gatherers. But that replacement wasn't complete. Modern Europeans carry WHG DNA, usually between 10 and 40% depending on the specific population. The Western hunter-gatherers didn't disappear. They were absorbed, intermingled, their genetics blending with incoming farmers to create the modern European gene pool. Their dark skin genes were gradually replaced by variants adapted for lower UV exposure in northern climates. But their blue-eye genes persisted and spread. That distinctive eye color that seems so European. That came from the Western hunter-gatherers, those dark-skinned, blue-eyed people who dominated Europe for thousands of years. Every time you see blue eyes in a European population, you're seeing an echo of the WHG. Every time genetic analysis reveals Western hunter-gatherer ancestry in modern populations, you're seeing proof that these people didn't vanish. They became us, or at least part of us. Their story is a reminder that human history isn't a simple march from primitive to advanced. It's a complex web of populations rising and falling, mixing and separating, each contributing something to the genetic and cultural legacy we carry today. The Western hunter-gatherers were masters of their world for 6,000 years. Then the world changed, and they changed with it, becoming something new, something that would eventually become us. The Eastern hunter-gatherers were different. If the Western hunter-gatherers were the familiar faces of post-Ice Age Europe, the people whose bones and tools we keep stumbling over in France, Spain, and Germany, then the Easterners were their quiet, distant cousins, the ones who lived beyond the forests, out on the open grasslands and frozen rivers of the far northeast, the ones whose story we almost missed entirely. Archaeologists call them Eastern hunter-gatherers, or EHG for short. It sounds clinical, like a label on a museum drawer. But behind that name were real people, real families, living in a world that felt very different from the damp forested valleys of Western Europe. Their home was the Great Northern Steppe. Today we call it Karelia, the Russian plains, the wide lands of Ukraine. Back then it was a patchwork of glacial lakes, birch forests, and vast rolling grass. In winter it froze hard enough that rivers became highways of ice. In summer it exploded with insects and birds and migrating herds. If the west was shaped by deep caves and coastal cliffs, the east was shaped by horizon, by distance, by wind. Genetically, these Eastern hunter-gatherers were not just a variation on the Western theme, they were something else entirely. When scientists first began sequencing their DNA from ancient bones found near Lake Onega in Karelia, or from Mesolithic burials in Ukraine, they expected to find the same Western European pattern with a few local quirks. They didn't. Instead, they found a strange blend. Part of their DNA looked European, yes, but another part carried echoes from much farther east. Signals that linked them, faintly but undeniably, to populations closer to Siberia. To older branches of humanity that had once roamed the northern forests and steppes, long before the ice retreated. It was as if the East held on to an older memory of the world, where Western hunter-gatherers seemed to descend mostly from the Magdalenian type, peoples who had sheltered in the southwest of Europe during the last glacial maximum. The Easterners looked like the heirs of a different refuge, perhaps in the exposed plains of the South Russian steppe, perhaps farther east, beyond the Ural Mountains, in some cold but stable pocket where the glaciers never quite reached. We don't know exactly where that refuge was. The Ice Age erased most of its traces, but the genes remain like a watermark. This is where the story becomes tantalizing, because when you look closely at EHG DNA, you see hints that they might be carrying ancestry from populations even more ancient than the post-Ice Age Europeans. People who may have split from other Eurasian groups tens of thousands of years earlier. People whose own camps and tools have long since been buried, crushed, or washed away. Some researchers suspect a connection between Eastern hunter-gatherers and the mysterious groups that once lived far to the northeast, populations that later gave rise to the ancestors of Native Americans. The genetic links are not simple, not direct, but there are shared threads, shared variants, shared whispers of an older migration wave that had pushed into the far north of Eurasia, adapted to the cold, and then fragmented into lineages we're only now beginning to recognize. When you hold that idea in your mind, the map of ancient Europe looks different. The West is no longer the whole story, with the East as a blank space. Instead, you see multiple streams of humans flowing across the continent, one stream coming out of southwestern refuges, spreading into France and Spain and Germany, another rising from the eastern plains, shaped by steppe winds and long winters, moving westward through Ukraine, Russia, and Karelia, and in the middle there's a zone of meeting, a zone of mixing. Central Europe, places that are now Poland, the Baltic states, parts of Belarus, became the genetic borderland where East met West. Not a sharp border like a wall, but a wide, fuzzy frontier where people carrying Western hunter-gatherer ancestry and people carrying Eastern hunter-gatherer ancestry met, traded, fought, and fell in love. We know this because their DNA mingled. Ancient skeletons from this central zone show hybrid signatures, neither purely Western nor purely Eastern, but a mosaic of both. This tells us that the people of post-Ice Age Europe were not frozen into separate, isolated blocks. They were moving. They were travelling along rivers, through forests, across frozen lakes. They were aware of each other. Imagine a band of Eastern hunter-gatherers following reindeer herds westward. The world is warming, new plants are growing, animal migration routes are shifting. The band is small, it's maybe 20-30 people, but they carry with them a particular way of life. Winter shelters shaped for open plains, hunting techniques designed for long visibility, for tracking animals across snow, not through dense forest. After weeks of travel, they reach a broad river that feels like a natural boundary. On the other side, the land begins to change. Trees become thicker, valleys deeper, and somewhere beyond those trees, living in rock shelters, moving along forest trails, are Western hunter-gatherers whose ancestors spent the last ice age in distant caves near the Atlantic. When those two worlds finally intersect, maybe at a river crossing or a meeting place on a lake shore, the border between East and West becomes a conversation, or a conflict, or both. We can't hear the words they spoke. We can't see the gestures, the cautious approaches, the shared meals, the exchanged tools, but their DNA remembers that the meeting happened. Karelia, in the far north, gives us some of the clearest glimpses of these Eastern peoples. There, near ancient lake shores and riverbanks, archaeologists have found burials dated to the Mesolithic period, roughly 8,000 to 7,000 years ago. The tools are often simple: flint blades, scrapers, tiny microliths that could be set into wooden shafts to make composite weapons. There are fishing tools, harpoons, and evidence of intensive use of rivers and lakes. The bones from these graves tell a quiet but profound story. The individuals show the typical Eastern hunter-gatherer genetic profile, that strange blend of European and more Eastern ancestry. Some of them carry variants later found across the northern steppe, and even in early pastoralist groups that would sweep into Europe thousands of years later. Farther south, in Ukraine, the evidence takes a slightly different form. Near the great river systems, the Dnieper, the Don, Mesolithic and early Neolithic sites show communities that were highly adapted to riverine life. They used fish traps, nets and boats. They exploited rich floodplain ecosystems. Their cemeteries sometimes contain dozens, even hundreds, of burials spread over centuries, suggesting that these were long-lived centers of human activity. DNA from these Ukrainian sites shows mixtures too. Eastern hunter-gatherer ancestry blending with other local lineages. This hints at a complex web of population movements. Not just one simple east-west wave, but multiple pulses. Small groups arriving, settling, intermarrying, then later being joined or replaced by new arrivals. Farther east again, across the wide Russian plains, we catch more fragmentary signals. Scattered bones, bits of DNA, patterns of ancestry that reappear in later steppe cultures that would eventually influence Europe during the Bronze Age. The genetic trail suggests that Eastern hunter-gatherers were not a tiny, isolated group. They were part of a broader northern belt of populations, stretching from Europe deep into the heart of Eurasia. Their world was mobile, seasonal, tied to migration routes of animals, the freeze and thaw of rivers, the opening and closing of forest corridors as the climate shifted. Their movements left tracks in their genes. When researchers map out these ancestries across space and time, patterns emerge. You see eastern hunter-gatherer components pushing westward in some periods, especially in the far north. You see western hunter-gatherer ancestry pushing eastward along other routes. And where they overlap, you find mixed individuals, genetic testimonies to marriages and alliances between groups that saw each other not as abstractions, but as neighbours. Yet culturally, they still seem distinct. The stone tools from eastern sites often follow different traditions than those from the west. Different shapes, different methods of manufacture, the placement of cemeteries, the kinds of ornaments buried with the dead, the ways bodies were arranged. All of these suggest that eastern hunter-gatherers had their own ideas about life and death, their own rituals, their own stories. Some graves in the east show elaborate use of red ochre, sprinkled over bodies or spread on the grave floor. Others include carved bone pendants, animal teeth, or carefully shaped stone tools. These might be status symbols, protective charms, or markers of identity. We don't know. And that's the haunting part. The DNA tells us that these people were there, that they were important, that they contributed to the genetic tapestry of later Europeans. But their voices are almost completely gone. We can see that they were different from Western hunter-gatherers. We can guess that they traced their ancestry back to older, more easterly populations. We can track where they spread, where they mixed, where their genetic lineages faded or were absorbed. But we can't reconstruct their myths. We can't hear how they explained the stars over the steppe, or what they believed happened after death, or how they spoke about the ice that had once covered their ancestors' lands. Every new genome we sequence from Karelia, Ukraine, or the Russian plains adds another pixel to the picture, but the resolution is still low. We're left with outlines and shadows. We know there were eastern hunter-gatherers. We know they were cousins to the Westerners. We know they carried traces of even older populations, bridging Europe and the deeper heart of Eurasia. We know they moved and mixed, and left descendants whose genes persisted into much later times. But the cultures themselves, the songs, the taboos, the jokes, the fears, slip through our fingers. In the end, the Eastern Enigma is a reminder that our knowledge of the past is deeply uneven. Some regions, like southwestern Europe, glow brightly in the archaeological record, full of painted caves and well-preserved tools. Others, like the northern steppe, flicker at the edge of our vision, visible mostly through scattered bones and the silent code of DNA. Somewhere out there, under meters of soil, under collapsed river banks and peat bogs, lie campfires that belong to these eastern peoples, charred bones from their meals, broken tools from their hunts, maybe even carvings or ornaments that would tell us what they thought was beautiful, or sacred, or dangerous. For now, we only have hints. The eastern hunter-gatherers stand in the background of Europe's story, not invisible but blurred, not forgotten exactly, but not yet fully remembered. And as we follow their faint footprints across the plains, we begin to realize that the disappearance of peoples is not always a sudden vanishing. Sometimes it's a slow blending, a gentle dissolving into others, until all that remains is a quiet signal in our genes, a whisper from the steppes, still carried in the bodies of their distant descendants. For tens of thousands of years, Europe belonged to them. Magdalenian hunters tracking reindeer across windswept plains, Western hunter-gatherers fishing in ice-cold rivers, painting caves, burying their dead with care. Eastern foragers moving silently through deep forests and along misty river valleys, leaving behind stone tools, ornaments, and fragments of DNA in ancient bones. Generation after generation they watched the ice retreat and the forests advance. They adapted to changing animals, changing plants, changing seasons. They survived volcanic winters, Sudden cold snaps and slow warmings that turn tundra into dense woodland. And then, in the genetic record, something astonishing happens. They almost vanish. Not overnight, not in a single apocalypse, but when geneticists start sampling bones from later periods, 5,000 years ago, 4,000 years ago, 3,000 years ago, the signature of those ancient hunter-gatherer populations becomes faint. Sometimes just a whisper, sometimes gone entirely. It's as if entire peoples, whole cultures, billions of lived days and nights slipped beneath the surface of history without a sound. So where did they go? To answer that, we need to remember that Europe after the Ice Age was not a frozen museum. It was a living, changing continent. Forests rose, coastlines shifted, rivers carved new channels, and from the southeast something else was moving, slowly at first, then faster, farmers. Around 9,000 years ago, far away in Anatolia, what is now Turkey, people were doing something revolutionary. They weren't just hunting animals, they were keeping them. They weren't just gathering wild grains, they were planting them, tending them, harvesting them in cycles that obeyed seasons instead of migrations. They had villages, pottery, domesticated wheat and barley, goats and sheep, a different relationship to land and time. And little by little, those farmers began to move, north through the Balkans, west along the Mediterranean coast, up the great river valleys of the Danube and the Rhine. Archaeologists can trace their path by the appearance of new pottery styles, new tools, new house plans. Geneticists can trace their path in an even more intimate way, by watching their DNA gradually replace the DNA of the hunter-gatherers who had lived in Europe for thousands of years. On paper, in graphs and charts, it looks almost surgical. The old hunter-gatherer genetic line steeply declining, the Anatolian farmer ancestry rising like a tide. But no one experienced it as a graph. For people actually living through it, this would have been a slow, strange unfolding. One day your band hears of a clearing upriver where people grow food in the ground and don't move with the seasons. Another day you see smoke from a village you didn't know was there. You approach cautiously and find people who speak a language you don't understand, but who have grain to trade and goats that never seem to run away. Did they fight? Did they share? Did they marry each other? The answer is probably yes, to all of it. Some regions show signs of conflict. Palisaded villages, burned layers, skeletons with violent injuries. Other places suggest peaceful coexistence, with hunter-gatherer camps near early farming settlements, sharing the same landscapes, the same rivers, perhaps the same festivals. Genetics hints at a complicated picture. The first wave of Anatolian farmers in Central Europe seems, at many sites, surprisingly genetically homogeneous. For a time, they look like a new population expanding into old lands with relatively little local mixing. But not everywhere. Along the coasts, in rugged mountains, in dense forests and marginal lands, hunter-gatherer ancestry lingers. There are burials where people look genetically like local foragers, but are buried with farmer-style pottery. There are individuals with clear mixed ancestry, half descended from Anatolian villagers, half from the old European lineages. These are the children of both worlds, the last people who might have heard the old hunter-gatherer songs and the new farmer rituals in the same household. Was it a peaceful migration, or a replacement? The evidence refuses to pick a single story. In some places, farmers probably moved into nearly empty landscapes, regions that had been lightly populated after the Ice Age, or abandoned after climatic shifts. In others, they may have pushed aside local groups directly or indirectly by fencing off land, cutting down forests, changing the patterns of animal migration. Sometimes peace might simply look like being outcompeted. If your neighbours can produce predictable calories from fields and herds, and your group relies on wild game that becomes scarce as forests are cleared and animals are driven away. You don't need a battle to lose your territory. You just slowly lose your options. Your children start working in the fields instead of following the reindeer tracks. You begin to marry into the farming families because that's where the food is. That's where the stability is. Culture shifts. Gene pools shift. The old way of life thins out. But the story doesn't end there, because just when you might think Europe's genetic fate is settled, early farmers replacing most of the old foragers, with a few traces left in remote corners, another wave appears, this time from the east. Around 5,000 years ago, across the vast grasslands of the Eurasian steppe, a very different kind of society had been taking shape. Mobile pastoralists, people whose lives revolved around horses and cattle, wagons and wide horizons. They buried their dead under mounds. They carried weapons, drank from decorated cups, and according to many researchers, may have spoken early forms of languages that would one day become most of the major tongues of Europe. Archaeologists call some of these groups the Yamnaya. Geneticists call them something else, transformative. When their DNA appears in European samples, it doesn't creep in, it surges. In many regions, steppe ancestry replaces half or more of the existing gene pool within a surprisingly short period. In some male lineages, the shift is almost total. Local Y chromosome lines vanish, replaced by those carried by men from the steppe. Was this an invasion? A series of migrations? An elite takeover? Again, the evidence suggests a mix. Some sites show mass graves with signs of violence. Others show gradual intermarriage. There may have been moments of brutal conquest, and there may have been periods where local farmers willingly adopted steppe customs, learned steppe languages, followed charismatic leaders who arrived from far away. However it happened, the result was profound. By the time the Bronze Age was in full swing, many parts of Europe were genetic mosaics, threads of ancient hunter-gatherer DNA, woven together with Anatolian farmer ancestry, overlaid by steppe pastoralist genes. The old Ice Age peoples were still there, but now as faint echoes mixed into new genetic blends. So how much mixing actually occurred? This is one of the most hotly debated questions in European prehistory. Some researchers argue that what we see is essentially replacement. New populations taking over old territories, with only light admixture at the frontiers. Others see evidence for complex long-term interbreeding, with local hunter-gatherers repeatedly reappearing in the gene pool after periods when they seem to vanish. Ancient DNA keeps complicating the picture. A burial that looks Neolithic farmer turns out to have surprisingly high hunter-gatherer ancestry. A Bronze Age grave full of steppe-style artifacts reveals a genome that's half local, half incoming. The truth may be that Europe's population history is less like a series of clean waves washing away what came before, and more like a braided river. Streams split, merge, diverge, and flow together again. Over time, some channels dry up, others widen, but everywhere the water is mixing, and modern Europeans? They carry all three stories in their cells. On average, people across Europe today have significant ancestry from ancient Anatolian farmers, substantial contributions from steppe pastoralists, and smaller but still measurable fragments of the Ice Age hunter-gatherers who once roamed the continent from the Atlantic to the Urals. The exact proportions change from place to place. In some northern regions, hunter-gatherer ancestry is a little higher. In parts of southern Europe, farmer ancestry dominates. In others, steppe ancestry peaks. But almost nowhere is any one component pure. Even in populations that arrived later, like some that moved in during the Iron Age or historical times, the deep layers are still visible. Scrape back far enough, and you find traces of people whose worlds have been gone for millennia. How fast did all of this happen? On an evolutionary timescale, incredibly fast. The main Neolithic expansion across much of Europe likely unfolded over just a few thousand years. The major steppe-associated genetic shifts in some regions may have happened in only a few centuries. In human terms, that's not some abstract blur. That's the difference between your great-grandparents' world and your own. Imagine being born into a village where everyone looks, talks, and lives like their ancestors have for generations. Then, by the time you're old, your grandchildren speak a different language, worship different gods, and have faces that subtly reflect a mixture of old and new ancestries. Now stretch that experience across an entire continent. And what about the parts of these peoples that don't fossilize or preserve in bone marrow? Their languages, their stories, their jokes, their lullabies. Here, the silence is almost total. No one wrote down the language of the Western hunter-gatherers, or of Magdalenian reindeer hunters, or of the Eastern foragers who left their DNA in scattered burials. By the time writing appears in Europe thousands of years later, countless tongues have already risen and fallen, leaving no direct record. Some linguists think that a few roots in modern Indo-European languages might reach back to early farmers, or even to forager vocabularies. But this is speculation at the edge of what's possible to infer. The safe answer is, we don't really know. Their myths might have tried to explain the ice, the great animals, the stars overhead. Their rituals might have honored caves, rivers, mountains, or the bones of ancestors. Their music might have echoed off cave walls in melodies we would find hauntingly familiar, or utterly alien. What happened to all of that? In genetic terms, it didn't entirely disappear. It was absorbed. Children born to mixed parents carry not only genes, but also fragments of two cultures. They might favor the language of whichever side has more power, more food, more prestige. Over a few generations, the old tongue might shrink to a few ritual phrases, a secret song, a nickname for a river. Then even those vanish, as elders die, and grandchildren choose the more widely spoken language. But ideas are slippery. They move even when their original words are lost. A story about a hero hunting a giant animal might be retold with new names and new gods, but the same basic shape. A sacred hill might keep its special status through waves of new religions, each layering its own meaning over the last. A taboo about entering certain caves might survive as a superstition no one can fully explain. In that sense, the Ice Age peoples of Europe may not have disappeared at all. They may be hiding in plain sight, woven into stories that later generations forgot how to trace back. In your DNA, they are numbers and percentages. In reality, they were faces, voices, hands. Children learning to walk on cold ground. Parents telling stories by firelight. Elders remembering a time when the ice stood closer on the horizon. The Great Disappearance is not a single moment when they were wiped away. It is the long, quiet process by which they were folded into others, replaced in some places, absorbed in others, transformed everywhere. We know this from bones, from tools, from DNA. But beyond that, there is a darkness we can't fully pierce, a silence where languages once flowed, and yet, as we'll see, they are not entirely gone, because in a very real sense, they're still here, inside us. If you could see your own DNA as a kind of time-lapse film sped up over tens of thousands of years, you'd watch people appear and vanish, move and mix, whole cultures rising and then dissolving into others. The strange part is, most of the actors in that film have no names, no written records, no stories we can point to and say, those were my ancestors, but they're still here, in your blood, in your immune system, in the way your body handles cold or altitude or certain foods. The lost children of the Ice Age never really vanished. They just changed addresses, moving from the steppe and the forest into the chromosomes of the people alive today. If you want to find them, you don't look at maps or ruins first. You look at genes. When geneticists started comparing ancient hunter-gatherer DNA to modern Europeans, they expected to find a faint diluted signal, a background whisper. But in some places the whisper turned out to be a shout. Northern Europe is one of those places. Modern populations in the Baltic region, Lithuanians, Latvians, Estonians, carry some of the highest levels of Western hunter-gatherer ancestry in all of Europe. In their genomes, you can still see clear echoes of those reindeer hunters and forest foragers who moved across the icy plains as the glaciers retreated. Farther west, in places like Britain and Ireland, the signal is still there, just mixed with later arrivals, early farmers who came from Anatolia, and steppe herders moving in from the east during the Bronze Age. Even in people who think of themselves as thoroughly modern European, a surprisingly large fraction of their DNA came from those Mesolithic hunter-gatherers who once camped along glacial lakes and followed migrating herds. In the rugged north of Scandinavia, another thread appears. Some indigenous Sami groups carry ancestry linked to ancient foragers of northern Eurasia, people adapted to bitter winters and endless summer light. Their DNA hints at very old survival strategies, ways of living with extreme cold that go back long before written history. Other regions tell a different story. Southern Europeans, especially in places like Greece, Italy and the Balkans, carry more ancestry from early Neolithic farmers. But even there, under layers of agricultural and Bronze Age migrations, the genetic fingerprints of Ice Age and post-Ice Age hunter-gatherers haven't disappeared. They've just been blended like old pigments mixed into a new painting. You can't always see the original colour clearly, but it still shapes the final image. The legacy of these lost peoples isn't just about percentages of ancestry. It's about very specific gifts from the deep past, genetic tools tuned by survival in a world of ice and scarcity. Some of those tools are hiding in your immune system. Certain modern Europeans, for example, carry genetic variants linked to stronger immune responses against particular pathogens. When researchers trace those variants back in time, they find them in ancient hunter-gatherers, and sometimes in Neanderthals and Denisovans as well. Immune tricks that once helped small bands survive strange Ice Age diseases now help their descendants fight off modern infections. Other genetic gifts are about how your body handles the environment, variants that affect how you process fats and carbohydrates, how you store energy, how your body reacts to cold or to long winter nights. In a frozen landscape where food was unpredictable, a metabolism that clung to every calorie was a lifesaver. In a warm modern city with supermarkets and desk jobs, the same genes can become a risk factor for obesity or diabetes. What was once an adaptation becomes a mismatch. Some traits are more mysterious. Ancient hunter-gatherer DNA has been linked to skin pigmentation patterns, hair color, eye color, features that would have changed as people moved into higher latitudes with weaker sunlight. Early European hunter-gatherers may have had combinations of dark skin and light eyes, or other unusual mixes that don't neatly match any modern group. The palette of Ice Age humanity was probably far more varied and surprising than the simple categories we use today, but perhaps the most intriguing modern echoes of Ice Age peoples are found in populations with unusual genetic signatures, people who look, on paper, a little out of place, a little too different from their neighbours. The Basques of the Western Pyrenees are one of the most famous examples. Linguistically, they're an island. Their language, Euskara, is not clearly related to any other living language in Europe. Genetically, they're different too. For a long time, some researchers thought the Basques might be direct, mostly unmixed descendants of Europe's Ice Age hunter-gatherers. That story has turned out to be more complicated. Ancient DNA shows that the Basques, like everyone else in Europe, are a blend. Hunter-gatherers, early farmers, and steppe herders all contribute to their ancestry. But the mix is unusual. The Basques seem to carry a higher proportion of early European farmer ancestry, and a distinctive pattern of hunter-gatherer input, with relatively little gene flow from late Bronze Age and later populations. In other words, they weren't frozen in time, but they were somewhat shielded from some of the later population waves that swept across Europe. Their genes are like a slightly clearer window into the past, preserving a version of the European genome that's closer to the blend that existed 5,000 or 6,000 years ago. They aren't alone. Isolated mountain valleys, remote islands, and long-lived rural communities across Europe sometimes show odd genetic signatures. Sardinians, for example, retain unusually high levels of early farmer ancestry. Some groups in the far north show stronger connections to ancient Arctic foragers. Each of these pockets acts like a small genetic museum, preserving older layers of Europe's past that have been diluted elsewhere. What's striking is how often these outlier patterns line up with geography that would have been difficult to conquer or colonize in the Bronze and Iron Ages. High mountains, rocky coasts, deep forests. The same landscapes that once sheltered Ice Age hunters from the worst of the cold later sheltered their descendants from the waves of migration that followed. Our view of all this is changing so fast that any map you draw today is almost guaranteed to be wrong in a decade, or at least incomplete. When scientists first sequenced the genome of a Mesolithic hunter-gatherer from Luxembourg and a Neolithic farmer from Germany, they thought they were seeing the big pieces of Europe's story. Hunter-gatherers replaced or absorbed by incoming farmers. Then they analysed more skeletons, and more. And suddenly a third player emerged. People from the steppe, herders and horse riders, pouring into Europe from the east during the Bronze Age. For a while that was the new grand narrative. 3 main ancestral populations. But then came the ghosts, genetic components that didn't fit neatly into any of those 3 categories. Signals that looked like they came from populations we had never sampled, never named, never seen in the archaeological record. These ghost populations didn't leave clearly labelled skeletons, but their DNA keeps showing up as a missing piece in the equations scientists use to model ancient ancestry. Each year, new burials are sequenced and new surprises appear. A hunter-gatherer child buried in a cave with unexpected genetic links to distant regions. A small group in Eastern Europe carrying ancestry that looks like a blend of people we don't yet have direct samples for. A tiny population on an island showing a genetic signature that suggests a distinct, local group survived there for thousands of years before vanishing. The technology driving this revolution is advancing almost absurdly fast. Early ancient DNA work required unusually cold, dry, well-preserved bones, and even then contamination was a constant threat. Now, with better lab techniques and more sensitive sequencing machines, scientists can extract DNA from tiny fragments, from teeth, from the petrous part of the temporal bone inside the skull, places where genetic material hides for millennia. New computational methods let researchers tease apart ancestry that's been mixed and remixed over thousands of years. They can reconstruct population movements from subtle patterns of shared mutations, detect ancient interbreeding events, even estimate the size of long-vanished groups. With each new dataset, the picture becomes both clearer and more complicated. And yet, for all this progress, vast stretches of the story are still missing. We don't know the names these Ice Age peoples called themselves, what they thought about the world, how they explain the changing sky and the melting ice. We don't really know their languages, their songs, their personal stories. Genetic data can tell you who was related to whom, but not who loved, who grieved, who told the best jokes by the fire. Even at the biological level, there are big gaps. Large parts of Eurasia and North Africa remain undersampled. Entire climates, like humid tropical regions where bones decay quickly, are almost blank on the ancient DNA map. There may have been whole branches of the human family that thrived for thousands of years and then vanished without leaving a single readable genome behind. This is where the idea of ghost populations becomes more than just a technical term. It becomes a kind of haunting. We know they were there because the math doesn't work without them, because modern genomes bend in directions that don't make sense otherwise. But we don't know what they looked like, how they lived, where they wandered when the ice advanced and retreated. Could there be more of these ghost populations waiting to be discovered? Almost certainly. Every time scientists think they've nailed down the simple story, a new dataset arrives, and the simplicity dissolves. Another subtle ancestry component appears. Another ancient group refuses to fit the existing labels. It's like trying to finish a puzzle where the number of pieces keeps increasing. Somewhere, in caves not yet excavated, in graves still buried under forest or farm fields, there are bones holding the missing chapters. Genetic signatures that will reveal a fourth, a fifth, a sixth ancestral population in Europe. People who lived and died without ever knowing that tens of thousands of years later, strangers would read their DNA like a book. Until then, we walk around carrying their traces without realizing it. A quirk of your immune system. The way your body handles winter darkness. A shade of eye color. A slight shift in the curve of your skull. All of it shaped in part by people whose names have been lost to time, but whose legacy is written inside you, letter by letter, base by base. The Ice Age ended. The glaciers retreated. The camps and hunting grounds of those first Europeans disappeared under forests, fields, and cities. But their genes stayed, woven into everyone from the Baltic to the Atlantic, from the Arctic Circle to the Mediterranean. The lost children of the Ice Age are not entirely lost. They're just whispering now instead of shouting. And if we listen carefully, through bones and molecules and the faint patterns they leave behind, we can still hear them. Close your eyes for a moment and imagine the map of Europe after the ice began to melt. Not the clean, labelled map you know from school, but a living, shifting landscape. Glaciers pulling back like slow white curtains. Rivers cutting new paths through raw earth. Forests creeping north, one sapling at a time. Now imagine the people moving across that map. Small groups of men, women and children leaving footprints in slush that will be gone by morning. Smoke from campfires rising into skies that will never remember their names. Languages spoken, songs sung, stories told around the fire, and then gone. The strange thing is, our DNA still remembers some of them, and others, it's as if they were never there at all. As powerful as the genetic and archaeological evidence has become, when we look at Europe's first peoples, we are still mostly staring into darkness, with only a few small lanterns of data flickering in a vast night. And for every answer those lanterns give us, they cast new shadows, new questions, new mysteries we're not yet ready to solve. Let's walk into that darkness for a while. Think about those dark periods in the record. On a timeline, they look like gaps, centuries, sometimes thousands of years where layers of sediment are thick and silent. No tools, no bones, no hearths, no art. It's tempting to think nothing happened then, that people just paused. But that isn't how humans work. Somewhere in those missing centuries, children were born. People laughed, people starved, lovers met, elders died, bands broke apart and reformed. Entire languages flourished and vanished, without leaving so much as a carved stone or a bead of shell we can recognize. So what actually happened in those empty stretches of time? Did whole groups migrate out of Europe and never come back? Did they retreat to landscapes that are now underwater, swallowed by rising seas when the ice melted and coastlines moved dozens of kilometers inland? Many of the richest hunting and fishing grounds after the Ice Age would have been on those now drowned plains. Perfect places to live. Terrible places, archaeologically speaking, because they're buried beneath the waves. There could have been thriving communities out there on what is now the floor of the North Sea. Villages along long-vanished rivers. Networks of camps stretching across what used to be dry land between Britain and continental Europe. We call that lost landscape Doggerland, We have a few scattered finds dredged up by fishing nets and trawlers, a bone here, a tool there, but we've never seen their whole world. Were there people in Doggerland whose genes never made it into anyone alive today? Entire societies that left no surviving descendants, no stories in our DNA, nothing but a few broken tools in seafloor sediment? It's possible. Because one of the great unsettling truths of ancient DNA is this: some lineages appear in the record like ghosts, then blink out. A particular genetic signature will show up strongly in one region for a few thousand years and then nothing. It's not that we see it slowly fade, sometimes it just stops. What does that mean? One explanation is replacement. A new population comes in, larger, better adapted, or just luckier. Over time, they outnumber the older group. Interbreeding happens, but the older genetic lineages get diluted, drowned in a rising sea of newcomers. After enough generations, those early signatures are too faint for us to detect with our limited samples. Another possibility is catastrophe. Maybe those dark periods coincided with disasters we barely see in the climate record. A sudden cold snap that wiped out key herds, a mega flood from a melting ice dam, a volcanic eruption throwing ash across the sky, ruining several crucial summers in a row, a disease we have no name for that rippled through small vulnerable bands. Imagine a group of a few hundred people scattered across river valleys, coastlines and hills. Now imagine a new pathogen entering that world. No immunity, no medicine, no understanding of what's happening. You could lose half the population in a few seasons, maybe more. A few survivors might flee. Others stay and disappear into the ground, their bones never discovered, their genes never passed on. To us, looking back from tens of thousands of years in the future, it's just a gap, a silence on the timeline. But for them it would have been the end of everything. Violence is another candidate, not the Hollywood version of endless pitched battles, but something slower, more insidious. A slightly better hunting strategy, a new kind of weapon, a group that cooperates more tightly or shares food more effectively. Over centuries, one way of living nudges another out of existence. We know from later prehistory that violence could be devastating. Entire cemeteries show signs of mass killings, skulls cracked, bones with embedded arrowheads. These are from periods when agriculture had already begun, when populations were denser. But there's no reason to think the first hunter-gatherers were immune to conflict. With resources shifting under their feet as the climate warmed, as ice retreated and forests took over old grasslands, competition could have turned deadly. Do some of those vanished genetic lineages represent not just quiet fading, but outright extermination? Whole groups wiped out, their DNA erased from the future. The evidence is too thin to say, and yet the question lingers. Then there are the populations that don't vanish, but move in and out of the record like flickering lights. We see this with some of the early European hunter-gatherer ancestries. For a while, their DNA is everywhere we look. Then the signal weakens, and another genetic profile dominates. Later, after a gap, the earlier signal returns in a new region, mixed with others, changed, but recognizable. What happened in between? Did they retreat to refuges, mountain valleys, sheltered coasts, deep forests, where we simply haven't dug yet? Did they shrink to tiny populations, skating along the edge of extinction, only to grow again when conditions turned kinder? Was there a constant back and forth between eastern and western groups, waves of migration crashing against one another, blending and reshaping the genetic coastline of Europe? Our current samples are painfully limited. A few dozen skeletons here, a handful of teeth there. One cave with good preservation, another site where everything organic has dissolved into nothing. From this patchwork, we're trying to reconstruct what millions of people did over thousands of years. It's like trying to understand a 500-page novel when you only have 12 torn-out paragraphs, and you don't even know what order they're supposed to be in. So when we see a genetic lineage appear suddenly in the record, we have to be careful not to imagine it appearing suddenly in reality. The people were almost certainly already there, or nearby, long before we catch our first glimpse of them in a bone fragment. And when they disappear from our data sets, that doesn't always mean they vanished overnight. Sometimes it just means we haven't yet found the right bones. There is also the possibility that some peoples truly did leave no trace we can recognize. Maybe they lived in areas where bone and stone don't preserve well. Maybe they used mostly organic tools, wood, fiber, leather, that melt back into the earth without a sound. Maybe their numbers were always small, their camps light, their presence delicate enough to pass like a shadow over the land. They might have spoken languages with sounds that have never been heard again, told myths that were never folded into the stories of later cultures, raised children whose lines ended quietly in a winter no one remembers. From our perspective, looking back through genetics and stone tools, they would be invisible. Entire human worlds that our methods simply cannot see. Future discoveries will fill some of these gaps. New caves will be opened. Submerged landscapes will be mapped more carefully. Ancient DNA will be drawn from soils, not just bones, letting us detect who lived in a place even when their bodies are long gone. Techniques we can barely imagine now may one day reconstruct population histories from trace molecules clinging to old hearths or stone tools. When that happens, the story of Europe's first peoples may change in ways that are hard to predict. Some ghost populations might become real, their genetic signatures emerging from sediments beneath a cave floor. Dark periods might shrink or fragment as we uncover evidence of continuity where we once saw breaks. Lineages we thought were gone might reappear in unexpected places, revealing migrations that rewrote the map in ways we never dreamed of. Or we might discover entirely new branches of the human family tree. Not just Neanderthals and Denisovans, but other cousins who shared the post-Ice Age world with our ancestors and then vanished, leaving only whispers in the DNA of a few remote communities. But no matter how much we discover, there will always be a limit. Most of the conversations ever held will never be known. Most of the names ever spoken will never be recorded. Most of the jokes, the lullabies, the arguments, the fears, the small triumphs of daily life in those early European bands are gone beyond recovery. We can estimate population sizes, migration routes, and ancestry proportions. We can map how much of one ancient group's DNA survives in another. We can point to a bone and say, this person was related to that person, far away, centuries earlier. But we cannot tell you what they were thinking as they watched the sun set over a glacier edge. We cannot know what they believed about the stars. We cannot hear the first time a child in a Magdalenian camp asked, "Where did we come from?" and an elder tried to answer without any of the knowledge we now take for granted. That is the most humbling mystery of all. We have become used to thinking of the past as something we can recover if we just look hard enough. But when it comes to Europe's first peoples, and especially the lost children of the Ice Age, the lineages that rose, mingled and disappeared, we're reminded how much will always remain beyond us. In the end, what we're left with is a kind of double vision. On the one hand, we see the power of our tools. Genomes extracted from ancient bones, climate models reconstructing vanished worlds, radiocarbon dates pinning down lives lived tens of thousands of years ago. On the other hand, we see the vastness of what's missing. The unwritten stories, the unnamed dead, the entire peoples who may have walked across Europe and left nothing behind that we can find. Somewhere inside you, fragments of those ancient journeys still echo. Bits of DNA that passed through Ice Age camps, across thawing tundra, along riverbanks that no longer exist. You are, in a very real sense, carrying survivors of countless forgotten catastrophes and disappearances. But you're also the descendant of people who met others along the way. others whose children didn't make it this far, whose lineages ended in the dark. We can honor them only by acknowledging how little we know, by holding space in our reconstructions for the unseen and the unrecorded, by remembering that behind every clean genetic graph and every labeled timeline were real human beings walking through a world that felt as uncertain to them as ours does to us. As you drift towards sleep, let that uncertainty be a kind of comfort, because in the end, the mystery is not a flaw in the story, it is the story. So now, as the last embers of the story fade, picture Europe again. Not the Europe of maps and borders and highways, but the Europe of ice and wind and wandering firelight. Across this frozen frontier, whole peoples rose and vanished. The Magdalenian artists who painted light into the darkness of caves. The ghost populations whose DNA appears out of nowhere, like footprints on fresh snow with no trail leading in. The Western hunter-gatherers, patient and adaptable, masters of forests and rivers. The Eastern enigma, another forgotten people, threading silently through the same landscape from the other side of the dawn. Most of them left no written names, no chronicles, no legends we can clearly trace. Just tools, bones, pigments, a few teeth from a child in a cave. And yet, they are the ones who shaped the genetic and cultural foundations of Europe, long before anyone spoke of nations or history. They walked the same valleys that now hold cities. They crossed rivers that now flow beneath bridges and train tracks. They watched the same stars. Their story is, at its core, a lesson in resilience and impermanence. Resilience because again and again the climate turned against them. Glaciers advanced, forests died back, animals migrated or disappeared, and still people adapted. They changed their tools, their campsites, their hunting grounds, their alliances. They retreated when they had to, advanced when they could, learned to live with a world that never stopped shifting beneath their feet. Impermanence, because no matter how well they adapted, every culture you've met in this story eventually faded. The Magdalenians gave way to others. The Western hunter-gatherers were absorbed, diluted, remembered only as a genetic whisper. The Eastern peoples, too, dissolved into later waves. Entire ways of life that once filled continents with voices and laughter became invisible, except to those who know how to read bones and molecules. But disappearance is not the same as erasure. If you're listening to this, lying in the dark, you are proof that they were here. In the spirals of your DNA, there are echoes of those lost Europeans, fragments from Ice Age hunters standing in snow up to their knees, from mothers tending buried embers in windlash shelters, from children chasing each other through thawing meadows when the glaciers finally retreated. You carry their experiments, their successes, their lucky accidents, their immune defenses against ancient diseases, their adaptations to cold, to diet, to light, even their encounters with older humans and other human species, ghost sequences woven quietly into your genome, passed down through thousands of generations, long after their languages fell silent and their last camps collapsed back into earth. We may never know what they called themselves. We may never recover their songs, or the full meanings of the symbols they carved into bone and antler. But in a very real sense they are still here, breathing through us. Every heartbeat is a continuation of a story that began in those icy valleys, and that story is not finished. Every new cave discovered, every ancient tooth sequenced, every unexpected twist in the genetic data reminds us that history is still unfolding beneath our feet. There are more ghost populations waiting in the numbers, more forgotten migrations hidden in the soil, more mysteries drifting just beyond the edge of what we can prove. As you drift towards sleep, you can let your mind wander with them, along frozen rivers beneath auroras, through dark forests under unfamiliar constellations. Imagine the lives we can only glimpse, the choices we can only guess at, the worlds that existed before our words for them. When you wake, if you'd like to keep exploring these lost chapters together, you're welcome to stay with this channel. Gently tap like if this journey through the Ice Age helped you rest, and subscribe if you'd like more stories from the shadowy corners of the past. And if you feel like sharing, let me know in the comments where in the world you're listening from, which modern landscape now lies above those ancient trails. For now, let the noise of the present fade. Remember that you are a child of survivors, shaped by winters you never knew, carrying memories written in code older than history. The lost children of the Ice Age are not entirely lost. They are sleeping inside you, and the ice at last has melted.